There we go. Today's conversation is called Trust, Transparency, and Communication. And when I first had plotted this out, I was thinking primarily in terms of human psychology. However, it's occurred to me that I was thinking in the wrong direction. And so, as usual, I will rechart when I feel like I'm moving into a wrong direction on something. It's not that the material there wasn't good. It's just that's not the direction that this project I'm working on needs to go. And it further came to me that we have talked an awful lot about trust, and we've talked about learning to trust the God of the gospel. And when we move into July, the first, next week's lecture, which is the first July lecture, is on the gospel, this business of what constitutes the gospel. And from there, we're going to be opening up this business that occurs in the New Testament, that there are distinctions within Christianity, and thus distinction within the gospel itself and the way the gospel is understood and perceived. And that's going to be the whole month of July. And at the end of July, we're going to get into Marcion. Now, I will be bringing up some things related to this conversation about Marcion today, later on in the talk. But where I thought it would be important to start is a recognition of the fact that I'm doing theology, that is the discipline of theology, a little differently than is done in the normal world of academia. And I'm going to take a cue here from Dietrich Rischel's book, The Logic of Theology, where he says that anybody that wants to be a theologian should spend 10 years teaching the New Testament and early patristic literature. Then that person should spend a decade teaching church history. Then they're ready to begin teaching the discipline of theology. One of the things that has occurred since the turn of the 19th century, and it's especially true in the 20th century, is that there was a breaking apart of biblical studies and theology. And then there was a further break between the study of theology in contemporary environment and church history. Now, this break can be attributed to Schleiermacher's pedagogy back at the turn of the 19th century, when he divided up a typical divinity curriculum into the study of church history, pastoral care, biblical studies, and theology. And that's what we all know now. And that's where everything has moved. But rare is the thinker like a Dietrich Rischel or a Wolfhart Pannenberg who will bring together really excellent exegetical skills, that is, in the original languages, contexts, and cultures, together with a rich and often deep understanding of church history to the discipline of theology. And so most of the theology and the way we learn it tends to be from a catechetical tradition, whether we were involved in actual catechesis as an Episcopalian, an Anglican, a Roman Catholic, an Orthodox, or whether it was given to us as a system of doctrine. That's still a form of catechesis. And so most Christians, for them, the study of theology has to do in and around these doctrines and whether they're true or not, and whether they're based on the Bible. And that's the limitation of that model. What I'm trying to do with you is help you begin to see that there is an absolutely necessary connection when doing theology to work with the framework of the biblical text, and furthermore, to have as broad a knowledge as you can as to how that biblical text has been interpreted throughout the history of Christendom. There is there are two things that come out of the 20th century, well, the 19th and 20th century German theological tradition. The first is what's known as a Forschungsgeschichte, and that simply means a research history, a history of the research on a subject. So I love to collect books. I have lots of books that are like on the history of magic. I have a book on the history of fashion. I have a book on the history of technology. I have books on the history of this and the history of that, you know, the history of physics. I mean, it's kind of like I have all of these guides for dummies. Forschungsgeschichten, these histories of interpretation, what they allow you to do is they allow you to start at the beginning of a way of thinking or a discipline and show you how it developed over time. Show you the dead ends, show you the way thinkers would build on other thinkers. This is the beauty of a Forschungsgeschichte, and that's why every PhD dissertation, the first chapter's a literature review. You're reviewing all the literature on the topic that you're going to be writing about. You're doing a Forschungsgeschichte in that first chapter. And so I will share with you three, and you can find these on Amazon. One of them you can find for free just by typing the author's name and the title in and free PDF. It's out there. The first one is Stephen Niels. Some of you know that Tom Wright has updated Stephen Niels' The Interpretation of the New Testament. I don't have the updated version. This is my version because this is what I was reading back in the early 80s, was Stephen Niels' Interpretation of the New Testament. Okay? It was published in 1963. In 1970, and this is the one you can find free online, came the New Testament, the history of the investigation of its problems by Werner Georg Kümmel. Werner Georg Kümmel. The New Testament, the history of the investigation of its problems. Finally, the American William Baird has a 3-volume series just simply titled History of New Testament Research, and that's William Baird. B-A-I-R-D. This is volume 2, from Jonathan Edwards to Rudolf Bultmann. Those are 3 excellent volumes that, if you're serious about this business of understanding the gospel, you will want to understand how it is that one of the things that's very, very important, that is a chasm, an abyss between the conservative tradition and our more progressive liberal tradition, has to do with the historical critical method and the development and rise and changes in the historical critical method, all the way down to the 1960s. And in 1972, Walter Wink wrote a short little book that got him essentially kicked out of Union Theological Seminary in New York. The Bible and Human Transformation was the book, because in the first page, he says the historical critical theory is bankrupt. And it is certainly true that the way it was being practiced in the academy globally, particularly in America, the theory had become absolutely bankrupt. But that doesn't mean that practiced correctly, it's not a viable theory or a tool to be used by the theologian. Because we're going to have to apply that same exact set of tools when we study church history. We don't simply go back and read the big 800-page book on the flowers of St. Francis and assume that all the legendary material in that volume actually belongs to the historical Francis. We just don't operate that way. We know better. Nor do we take the Arthurian legends and assume that all those Arthurian legends can somehow be traced back to King Arthur in around 600. Nor do we take the legends of Sherwood Forest and Robin Hood literally, even though, again, there's real historical figures behind all of these. We just simply don't take at face value what we read. That's the historical critical method. It introduced a hermeneutics of suspicion. It introduced the possibility that writers had perspectives. It introduced this notion that history itself is a subjective discipline. It is not purely objective. And this would be the real turning point between the way history would be done in the 19th century, 18th and 19th centuries, and the 20th century. In the 18th and 19th centuries, history as a discipline tended to be oriented to what would be called raw data and trying to put all this data together. But in the late 19th century, after the work of Wilhelm Dilthey and into the 20th century, with the origins of structuralism and Ferdinand de Saussure's linguistic theory at the turn of the century, as well as Wittgenstein's work in the early 20th century, all questions relating to history now turned on the interpreter. And history was about how we interpret data. And so the two would be, of course, the ascendant one would be this raw data approach. But in the early 20th century, the other approach begins its ascent until they're about equal around the mid 50s, early 60s, where both sides are taken into account. And then the subjective side just goes off the map, especially in America, where history can no longer be done as a discipline. It's simply impossible because we do history in America now through an entirely polarized, politicized lens. And that's also true of church history in the churches. The subjective element has gone off the scale. What I suggest here is that any approach to the scriptures when it comes to history has to have an outside perspective that is not colored by one's tradition. Now, that doesn't mean that one's tradition is invaluable, nor does that mean that one is going to toss the tradition that one was raised in. But what one can learn to do by bringing in an outside perspective is to find correction. And that occurs through having to deal with contradictions. Now, in the Jesus-Driven Life, I proposed a fourfold model here that takes into account the historical critical method in doing theology proper. And I suggested, it's in the introduction, that we adopt this Wesleyan/Anglican model that incorporates the historical critical method, the best of the tradition of the church, how the gospel writers or the New Testament writers frame either Jesus or the gospel, how they frame it, and then finally, our own lived experience. That none of these can be discounted when it comes to what you and I would want to be able to call hearing the word of God. So when it comes to history, that's the piece that most of us will feel has the most arbitrariness in it. Even though we may have experienced arbitrariness in our experience, we may have experienced arbitrariness in our tradition, or in the way we think the gospel writers are framing Jesus' story, or the New Testament writers are framing the gospel narrative, the narrative of the gospel salvation story. There is a tremendous amount of arbitrariness in the historical critical method. You have to be aware of this. You have to be aware that when scholars are using this method, that they are all bringing all manner of presuppositions to the table. And because they tend not to examine these presuppositions, and because they also tend to go with the mainstream where it's convenient for them, what happens is there's this boatload of unexamined presuppositions out there in historical critical scholarship land. I'm making all of this here known to you so you can understand when I go to use the historical critical method, I will be appropriating it in the fashion that the great British scholars of the middle 20th century appropriated. I think for my money, when it comes to the historical critical method and the right use of it, the British scholars from, say, the 19 teens through the 1970s, that was the best period of historical critical scholarship, and it's in England. It's not in Germany, it's not in America. Germany's heyday in the historical critical method was the 19th century. And the problem with the use of the German historical critical method is that it tends to be quite speculative. So, for example, it's in Germany that there is a look at the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the recognition that there's a literary relationship between the three of them, a rejection of the Catholic Church's position that Matthew wrote first, then Luke, and then finally Mark abridged them in some kind of Reader's Digest condensed version, which is Augustine's viewpoint, and that's, of course, the Catholic viewpoint. No, it was the so-called Protestant discovery of the priority of Mark that would allow scholars in the 19th century to say, well, what about the material that's common to Matthew and Luke? Where did they get that from if they didn't get it from each other? And they created out of thin air an alleged document that we don't possess. It's gone. It evaporated in history, but we can reconstruct this document. It's called Q. And they call it Q because the German word Quelle, which means source, starts with a Q. And this document Q comes into source critical thinking on the gospel, so much so that in 1924, when B.H. Streeter publishes his massive work on the four gospels, the priority of Mark Q theory now becomes the theory for New Testament scholars mostly. Oh, there are rebels on the outside with the Griesbach theory and others, but the dominant theory becomes Mark and Q, a hypothetical document that never existed. And entire careers are built on being able to recreate Q. Check this out. They're going to recreate it, okay? First of all, as a document. Then starting in the 70s and 80s, when all this crazy structural and sociological analysis was running hot, they would go in and they would find the three different layers of Q and the three different communities behind each of these layers, and they would try to create this early Christian group that really had no cross or resurrection because they didn't need it, because Q was more like the Gospel of Thomas. It was just kind of a didache, you know, and Jesus was a sage and a wise man, the Savior, Son of God stuff, that's all nonsense. And these early Christians, we had them, they think like us moderns in the university. We reject all that divinity stuff and we just want a good Jesus. The scholarly community recreates Jesus in its own image in this fictional Q document. Now, I've posted in our group, and when you go look at it, you'll see that I do not take account of Q because I simply do not think Q ever existed. It just doesn't work. And to give you an idea, and this is just, this is an aside, it's a throwaway, how wild this can get. There was a Harvard professor, 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, named Morton Smith. And back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, as you know, if you taught at Harvard and you were in the New Testament or divinity school, coming out and being gay was not something you did. And you can build up a lot of resentment. And so Morton built up a lot of resentment against the academy. And he went out and forged a document called Secret Mark, an excerpt from this fake letter of Clement of Alexandria inserted in that secret mark, little sections from the Gospel of Mark that aren't found in our Gospels. One of which, you know, the story where Jesus goes and the guy runs naked from the garden. Well, the night before, Jesus and the guy had a little fun. Okay. So he forges this document, finds it in this monastery, takes pictures of it, so there's no physical document, takes pictures of it, proceeds to write books about it, and then has his students writing their PhD dissertations on this. There are people out there with PhD dissertations on alleged documents that don't exist and forged documents. And this is in America, folks. This is America. This is, for my money, there are very, very few New Testament scholars in America that I trust. Most of them are British. Look, even Doug Campbell, he teaches in America, but he's Kiwi. You know, he's from New Zealand. He was trained in a British system. So all of this to say that when you come to this literature, you're reading commentaries, you're reading books on studies, remember where you're reading it from. Is it from Germany? Is it from England or the UK or Britain, Cambridge, Oxford, or, you know, Nottingham, that kind of place, or is it from America? Always be aware of this. Now, having said this piece, this kind of upfront piece, this prologue, what I want to do is say to you that this theological framework that I'm developing is going to depend on a very judicious use of the historical critical method. That is, I'm going to apply this method to the New Testament the same way the historical critics have done. There are ways and means they do this. There's form criticism, there's redaction criticism, there's source criticism, there's textual criticism, there's linguistic criticism, there's sociological analysis. There are many forms it takes. And we want to be looking at all these as potential tools in the toolbox. You use a screwdriver on a screw and a hammer on a nail. And so what we want to ask when we come to text is, am I using the appropriate tool for this text, to be hearing this text? But at the same time, there's going to be another piece to this framework that's going to allow me to discern which tool to apply. And that's going to be the recognition that in the New Testament itself, we have two very, very different streams. One stream, which is oriented to the Jerusalem church, and another stream, which is oriented to Paul. Now, I don't know if you've ever given much thought to this. If I were to say to you, when the gospel comes to you, it invites you to make a choice about Jesus. And you would all concur with that. Now, I want to make a second suggestion. When the New Testament comes to you, it invites you to make a choice about Paul. Every single book in the New Testament, with the exception of the fourth gospel and the three epistles of John, and probably Hebrews, but every other single letter is composed for or against Paul, and gospel and history and everything. So I'll give you my rundown in order. Matthew is composed against Paul. Mark is for Paul and for Peter, and it's going to be important where Mark is written from, because anything that comes out of Rome is the church that seeks to bridge Peter and Paul. Because this is one of the ways it's going to claim its primacy, is that it has the bones of both apostles. So Rome tends to be conservative. That is, it has that Petrine element. And it's the Roman documents that are going to, it's Rome that will end up creating this first actual canonical list we have in the Muratorian canon around the year 200. But here, Mark is written from Rome, but it's pro-Pauline. Luke is pro-Paul. We know that because Acts is pro-Paul. And both Luke and Acts are seeking to bring this Paul-Peter tradition together. That's why when you read the book of Acts, Paul doesn't sound like the Paul of the letters. He sounds more like Peter, and Peter sounds like the Paul of the letters. You know, whole stories get made up like the story of Peter going to Cornelius, is a made-up fictional narrative, as though Peter was the first one to go to the Gentiles, not Paul. So we have all of this in Luke and Acts. The writer of John I mentioned, we'll leave that writer out for a minute, but that writer is definitely anti-Peter. Every single time the beloved disciple or the other disciple, and there's 5 mentions between those two terms, is mentioned in the 4th gospel, it's always in a competition with Peter, and always the other disciple or the beloved disciple wins out. In John 1, the other disciple comes to Jesus before Peter. In John 13, it's the beloved disciple laying his next to Jesus, pride of place C. In John 18, it's the beloved disciple gets to go into the high priest's house, not Peter. In John 20, it's the other disciple that runs to the tomb faster than Peter. And in John 21, it's the other disciple that comes out of the boat first to Jesus. There's definitely an anti-Petrine slant there. Now, Book of Acts, pro-Paul, but also pro-Peter. It's a mediating document. Paul's authentic letters, pro-Paul, obviously, he wrote them. The pastoral epistles, which are not written by Paul, Timothy, and Titus, pro-Paul, obviously, with a slant. Hebrews doesn't take a position. James, definitely not a fan of Paul. Even Luther could see that pretty clearly. 1 Peter, non-Pauline. I don't know that it's possible to say it was written against Paul. I wouldn't say that so much, but it definitely has elements in it that would be in conflict with Paul's thinking. 2 Peter, definitely anti-Pauline, with an explanation at the end of chapter 3 that, you know, some people try to read Paul's letters and they just can't make heads or tails of them. The epistles of John we'll leave out. In the book of the Revelation, anti-Paul, because the 7 churches that get critiqued in chapters 2 and 3 are Pauline churches. All these books in one place, inviting you to take a position for or against Paul. It is not unremarkable that it's been the rediscovery of Paul that has brought about the most significant changes in Christendom. One can think of Augustine, Luther, and Karl Barth. And now I would suggest Doug Campbell. I think Campbell's work on Campbell's work on Paul exceeds that of Barth or Luther or Augustine. For my money, and you'll hear me say this in a few weeks, between Rene Girard and Doug Campbell, the whole problem of Marcionism can be put behind us. We have a solution to the conundrum that has plagued the church since it began collecting the documents that form our New Testament canon. Now, I'm going to have a little fun with you over the course of the next several weeks as I play out for you how I see early Christianity developing and how I will use mimetic theory to show you that one tradition develops into a healthy gospel tradition and the other begins to turn Jesus back toward Torah. One, freedom from Torah. The other turns Jesus back toward Torah. Okay? And we're going to see this because at the heart of religion is the need to turn to law. Remember, it's one of the 3 pillars of human religion and culture. Prohibition is one, law, ritual, and myth, the way we tell the story to justify scapegoating someone. And it's this turn toward the law, which we have to be very, very careful about. Because what we do not want to do is we don't want to understand that turn in either an anti-Semitic or an anti-Judaic fashion. This is key. The reason we don't want to do that is because if we are anti-Semitic, Karl Barth says we're committing the sin against the Holy Spirit, and I sure don't want to do that. But if we're anti-Judaic, we're Marcionite. And neither one of those are workable solutions. So what I'll be showing you is that this business of the two streams of religion and revelation run through both testaments. The two streams of religion and revelation run through the Dead Sea Scrolls. They run through the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha. They run in Mishnah and Tosefta and Talmud, just as much as they run in patristic literature. And then on and on. Both streams, religion and revelation, are there from the beginning. Both streams run together. They always will, like the wheat and the tares. And it's not our place to do the harvest prematurely. And I think what that means for me is that I can go back in history and I can separate the wheat from the tares. But in the current field in which I stand, it's not time to harvest. I can't distinguish them yet. I don't know if you're familiar with that parable. It's referencing a certain weed called darnel that as it grows up alongside wheat looks identical to it until it gets to the flower stage. And then it looks different. So the two grow up together. And if you're a farmer and you're out there and you're chopping down the weeds, you might be chopping down wheat and not know it because they're virtually identical until the flower stage. So you can go back and you can do this in history and you can discern the good from the poor. But today you can't. So while I can, the furthest back I can go where I can talk about something that is, I think, at least credibly recognizable as good or poor, is the late 20th century. It's almost impossible to evaluate the last 20 years because we're in the midst of being influenced by all of this work that's being done out there. And so that brings us to a second point. So if we have Forschungsgeschichte, which is the history of research, we also have what Ulrich Lutz, L-U-Z, Ulrich Lutz, he's a Matthean scholar, brilliant scholar, has wonderful work on Matthew. He refers to as Wirkungsgeschichte, the history of the effects of a text. That is, it's not simply, you could write a dissertation, okay, how did the early Christian fathers interpret the Sermon on the Mount? How did the medieval writers interpret the Sermon on the Mount? How did modern writers? And you can do that. That's a history of research. But when you write about the history of the effects of a text, you're talking about something different. So for example, when you come to Matthew 23, I believe it is, where, Matthew 26, where in the trial scene, the religious authorities say, his blood be upon us and our generations. No, that's known as the blood libel phrase, okay? This one text, and it's the effects of the history of its interpretation, would justify Christian anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages, Luther's horrid anti-Semitism, which would flower in Lutheran Germany in the Holocaust. A text wrongly interpreted can have extraordinary deleterious effects out there. That also suggests to me that when we are interpreting a text, we have to ask about the implications of our interpretation. So we're not just simply looking back, doing good historical work, but when we interpret a text, we have to ask, what are the implications of this interpretation? How far can I see out? And if you want to see, if you want probably the best Christian thinker in the world, in the history of Christianity, that could see the implications of the implications of the implications of what he was writing, that would be John Calvin. That's one of the beautiful things about reading Calvin's work. He plays out the implications of the implications. And by the way, John Calvin's work, very different than Calvinism and Calvinists. A lot to disagree with Calvin. We all know this, but man, some great stuff in there in Calvin and Calvin's theology and way of life and his piety. So don't throw Calvin out because of the Calvinists. So we have both the history of interpretation of texts and the history of their effects. And we're going to be bringing all of this along with the mimetic theory when we read texts in the New Testament from this point on, which we'll be doing a fair amount of this next month. Because my proper goal now, having said this, is to set the stage for what is happening in the early 2nd century in Christianity. And we'll have a whole lecture on this, but I do need to frame the stage of that lecture now so that when it hits, it won't be so over the top for you. So if you were to have the timeline in front of you, what you would notice is I followed Doug Campbell's presentation of Paul's chronology 100%. There's nothing in Campbell's chronology that I can find to disagree with. I've read the 4 major chronologies that were published in the 20th century on Paul, and Knox, Hurd, and Taylor, and Jewett, and now Campbell. And Campbell was the one that absolutely, for my money, made absolute sense. After struggling for now 40 years, I've been reading these books in Pauline chronology, trying to create a real chronology of the early church. But Campbell's made perfect sense when he argued that the 10 authentic letters of Paul are composed between the summer of 50 and the summer of 52. Now, on my morning meditation this morning, this is not theological, but I have to share this. I was thinking about the things we leave behind in life that make a difference. And I would have thought, gosh, Paul founded all these churches, but all those churches are gone. They've been gone a long, 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 long time. And he talked to a lot of people, and their lives were transformed, but we really don't have any testimony of that. What we have are 10 letters, 10 emails, 10 Facebook posts that just have changed the world. I just thought that was kind of interesting to toy with, in terms of leaving a legacy behind. Okay, so here's what I want to suggest to you. The Gospels themselves are produced the Gospel of Mark is produced in and around the time of the destruction of the temple. It will be another 20 years before Matthew will rewrite Mark, and I'll leave it at that. And it will be some years later, just after the turn of the century, when Luke will have both Mark and Matthew and essentially rewrite it all. I see the Gospel of Luke being written about 20 to 25 years before the book of Acts. What we're going to do now is I'm going to take you to 3 theses that have to do with Marcion. And each of these theses also involves New Testament books. Most of us follow what's ever written in the introduction to a Bible book. Romans was written by Paul from Corinth in the year 55. And we assume that year is correct, and it doesn't mean anything to us. So I'm going to first tell you, ignore all that stuff. If you come across anything in your Bibles that suggests dates and places, you can probably ignore it. But the Gospels and the church underwent a massive, massive shift after the destruction of Jerusalem. The Jewish church, Christian church in and around Jerusalem, was wiped out. There was a flight to Pella, according to the tradition, and the Jewish Christian traditions headed east. The Jewish Christians from Jerusalem headed east. Jewish Christianity, from that point on, is separated from the Christianity around the Mediterranean, which tends now to become more and more dominated by Gentiles. Now, there are entire books in the New Testament, I should say letters of Paul, where he's writing to Gentile communities and he doesn't quote scripture. It wouldn't mean anything to them for him to quote scripture unless he's trying to show them that there's a one story narrative here, a prophecy fulfillment story. But when Paul writes to the Christians at Philippi, for example, which are all Gentiles, there's no reference at all to the Hebrew scriptures. The same thing in Colossians. Okay? So we have to ask the question as to what role the scriptures played in Pauline churches that were not Jewish. Would a Gentile church's acceptance of the Hebrew scriptures as inspired be the same as accepting circumcision? Do Gentiles have to accept these texts and this narrative in order to truly follow Jesus? I mean, these are questions. But as we move through this period of separation where Judaism is figuring itself out in the post-70 period under Rabbi Yohan ben Zakkai at this meeting in Yavne, and the rabbis are coming together and just trying to sort out who they're going to be now. They got no temple. Although there is a little evidence, Victor Epstein some years ago, 50 years ago, produced a small essay that suggests the possibility that there were some priests that still tried to carry on sacrifices in the temple all the way up until the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 to 135 before Hadrian just razed the whole thing to the ground. Titus did not tear the temple to the ground. The building was left standing if even though it was war-torn, so to speak. It's Hadrian that raises the temple. But nevertheless, Judaism has to reconstruct itself. And it does that under Rabbi Yohan ben Zakkai, who's a remarkable figure. He's kind of like the Paul of Judaism, helps them refigure out who they are. But as the Gentile churches separate, it makes sense that that separation is not simply geographical, but it's also theological. You're not going to see so much use of the scriptures in the Gentile churches. So much so that around the year, say 110, that's my estimate, that's a number of people's estimates, a certain fellow is going to come along and say, we don't need the Old Testament at all because we follow Paul. And that figure is Marcion of Sinope. So there's already going to be a predisposition in Gentile Christianity, an unfamiliarity with the Old Testament in the form of the Septuagint, by the way. Okay? It's going to be an unfamiliarity with it. It's little wonder that when you start going through the apostolic fathers, you don't see a whole lot of use of the Hebrew scriptures. You just don't see it. Not like you would say in Romans 10, 9, 10, and 11, or even in some of the Gospels. So that the first thing I think we have to consider here is that when Marcion comes on the scene, there's already, remember, there's a ton of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism in the ancient world. And so it would be natural for Gentile Christianity to want to distance itself from Judaism. Now that it no longer has the apostolic community that had formed around the original 12, that group is now gone. They're off the page. What remains are those who followed Paul and Peter to Rome. And now the Roman church toward the end of the first century, I mean, just as the Gospels are starting to be written, the Roman Church is beginning to position itself as the leading church of the Mediterranean. And we can see this in the letter of First Clement to the church at Corinth. There's no Roman papacy yet. I mean, there are Roman bishops, but there's no primus inter pares, no one overall concept yet. But the beginnings are there, and the beginnings in Rome in the 90s are going to be bringing these two traditions together. 30 years later, in the teens, Rome is ascending. Its line of bishops is intact. And as it's ascending, there's this fellow in Asia Minor, and he's teaching there 20, 25 years. He comes to Rome in the 130s, and he will teach there for a number of years, try to become a member of the church, be rejected as a heretic. And it's the churches that he founds that become a major competitor to the so-called Orthodox churches in the 2nd century. The Marcionite churches grew. Marcionite churches grew. In fact, the Marcionite churches still exist today. They can trace their history all the way back. If you go to India, there's still Marcionite churches. We want to be able to come to this topic that's now going to be the big convolution. How do we understand the relationship between the gospel and the law, the New Testament and the Old Testament, the church and Israel, Paul and the apostolic community? How do we understand these relationships? And so as I end this talk for today, I want to suggest that when we explore this, we have to avoid the Scylla of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism on the one hand, and we also have to avoid the Charybdis of a compromise that turns the gospel back into law or mythology.